When you think of spy fiction, what comes to mind? Is it the glamour of Monte Carlo casinos and Aston Martins, or the gritty, rain-slick streets of Cold War Berlin? Today, we're going to talk about 5 literary giants who essentially created the spy novel genre as we know it. They're the architects of intrigue, masters of suspense. Now, you'll probably be like, oh yeah, but so-and-so's not on the list and such is not on the list. And maybe we all have our different lists, but I think I've gone for 5 solids here. And we'll see if you agree with me. The 5 are Eric Ambler, Graham Greene, Ian Fleming, Len Deighton, and of course, the one and only John le Carré. Two distinct groups, if you like, of spy fiction emerged from these men. The story of how they influenced and sometimes even disliked as well as liked each other. They found each other's works fascinating, and their lives could be just as fascinating as well as any of the characters they wrote about. Hello, my dear book friends. Welcome to and welcome back to Book Time with Elvis. And as you know, coming soon is the event of Dr. November, of which I am proud to be the founder and co-host, along with a plethora of other wonderful people, all of whom will be left down below. So those are the 5 people I've gone for. And I think they're, as I say, a solid choice. Now, you might be thinking perhaps someone like John Buchan could be there, maybe even some American writers or others. But I've gone for the 5 I know best, and the 5 I feel most confident talking about, and the 5 I have the most experience with, at least up to this point. So let's start off with the pioneer, Eric Ambler. So really, he is the granddaddy of the spy novel as we see it and enjoy it today. Now, John Buchan, of course, would have come before him. William Le Queux would have come before him with his really basic form of spy stuff, and there's probably others as well. But I think when we think of spies and the kind of genus of that, I believe, comes from Eric Ambler. He's been called the source on which we all draw, and this was said by none other than John le Carré. Ambler wrote in the 1930s, with of course the storm clouds of World War II gathering around him and the rest of the world, and he did something revolutionary. He took the spy story out of the hands of just gentlemen adventurers and gave it into the hands of ordinary people. So, if you like, people like Richard Hannay to some degree, of course, are gentlemen. The spies seen in earlier works by people like Le Queux as well would have been this gentleman adventurer. And possibly even ones written about in The Great Game too. I mean, Kim, of course, isn't really a gentleman, being a street urchin on the streets of an Indian city, which escapes me. I can't remember now if it's Bombay or Calcutta, but it doesn't matter. For the sake of this, it doesn't matter. So the interesting thing about Ambler, as we said, he's taken that role of the spy and put it into more ordinary people. And generally those people aren't even spies themselves. They're not trained spies generally. They're writers, teachers, engineers, who just happen to stumble into worlds of political intrigue and conspiracy. His earlier works, or his most famous early thrillers, if you like The Mask of Demetrius, for example, is set in places like Greece and Turkey, bizarrely places that Ambler hadn't actually ever been to before. And he wrote those works just from a hotel in France, so showing that if you have good research and a good imagination, you can still turn out something really quite special. Graham Greene, as well as le Carré, was also a big fan of Eric Ambler, and Greene even refers to himself as a disciple of Eric Ambler, which is kind of cool, really. I'm not sure though, actually, if Greene was older than Eric Ambler, which would be interesting, or maybe they're around the same age. But certainly, when it comes to the espionage books, Eric Ambler is the goat, let's say. So let's move on to Graham Greene himself, as we already mentioned him. He's written a slew of wonderful books. I know our group read for Dr. November is The Quiet American. I know certain members of our group, or one particular member of our group doesn't necessarily think it falls into the espionage category. I disagree, of course, because I think having even as a backdrop to a different story, I still think it fits. But that's something we can discuss in our lives when we talk about the Quiet Americans. So Graham Greene, of course, is a literary heavyweight. He wasn't just a novelist. He did actually act as an intelligence officer during the Second World War, and he worked in Africa. And very interestingly, while he was working in Africa, his boss there was none other than Kim Philby. And Kim Philby, of course, if you don't know, was a very infamous double agent who worked for British intelligence, but was also at the same time working for the Russians or the Soviets. Now, Greene did bring in a lot of moral ambiguity into his books. There are a lot of other themes that run through his books. He referred to them as his entertainments, and he explored also the psychological toll and the blurry lines between right and wrong within the world of espionage. Again, maybe something that wasn't really done before. He was very well traveled, and that, of course, would have fueled his novels. The Quiet American, as I mentioned, is our group read for Dr. No-vember, and it is not an espionage novel alone. It is pretty much a critique, quite a searing critique, one could say, of American foreign policy in Vietnam, which is prophetic in the sense that, it's done so before Vietnam even becomes a major conflict. He also does satire. If you look at something like Our Man in Havana, it is a very interesting satire on how easily intelligence agencies can be fooled. And that's something that I think we can even see later in something like The Tailor of Panama by John le Carré as well. So, yeah. In one of his books called The Human Fact, he says, the innocent are always drowned in the wake of a big ship. And I think that kind of sums up very nicely Graham Greene's attitude, really, to a lot of things concerning espionage and how he views it as someone who, of course, was involved in it. Now, the third one we're going to look at is Ian Fleming, of course, one of the most famous and iconic, well, if not most famous and iconic authors, he's certainly the author of one of the most famous and iconic spies of all time. It's a big bang in the in the world of espionage literature when Ian Fleming came along and put out James Bond 007, of course. If Eric Ambler and Graham Greene were writing about the dreary reality of spying, then Fleming certainly comes along creating a glorious fantasy and showing it in this rather amazing light that made men all over the world and of different ages wanting to be the main hero he creates, James Bond. Of course, was it ladies want to be with him and all men want to be him, or something like that, I suppose. Like Greene, Fleming himself served in the intelligence in intelligence during the war. He served in naval intelligence, which of course is apt given that Bond also starts off in naval intelligence. And if you've heard of Operation Mincemeat, which was a big deception run by naval intelligence against the Germans in the Second World War, there is a book by Ben McIntyre about it, and there's a film based off that book. It was a very bizarre but brilliant deception that took place during the war, and he was an instrumental part of that, and of course he is depicted in the film, and I mentioned naturally, of course, in the book. So he knew the world and the realities of the world, but he chose to make it really impossibly glamorous. Now, James Bond, of course, is the ultimate escapist hero. Fleming creates this clear world of good versus evil. There's not a lot of ambiguity in the actual world. There can be some within Bond himself, of course, but the British spy is very sophisticated. He's very ruthless. And I think that's some of the criticism laid at how way Bond is portrayed in the films, that he's often much nicer than he is in the book. He seems to sometimes be less ruthless. Different actors do play him in different ways, of course. My particular favourite, of course, Sean Connery is the ultimate, but my favourite of the ones that I kind of lived through would be Timothy Dalton. Someone only made two James Bond films, but I like him because he has that more kind of ruthless streak that someone like Roger Moore was lacking, I think, anyway. Fleming wrote his Bond novels from, I don't know if he wrote all of them, but he certainly wrote a few from his villa in Jamaica, and of course everybody knows the name of the villa was GoldenEye, which later went on to become a film in its own right. The resurgence of Bond in the 90s, the mid-90s, when Pierce Brosnan took on the mantle as well. He described his own books as straight pillow fantasies of the bang bang kiss kiss variety, which I think is a nice and interesting way to describe them. And he was fully aware, really, of the type of novel he was creating. Though, again, the relationships between these different writers are kind of interesting too, because Graham Greene knew Ian Fleming and even visited him at GoldenEye, although when Ian Fleming asked him to write an introduction for a Bond novel, he refused. So, I don't know. But yeah, we can't deny the impact of Ian Fleming and James Bond. You know, everybody knows. Everybody around the world knows that. You know, what's your name? You know, my name's Bond. James Bond. It's an absolute classic, isn't it? Fantastic. So let's move on to the next, the last two really, which are Len Deighton and John le Carré coming up. So Len Deighton is the newest one to me. I have read, well, he's not newest in terms of chronology. I read the Ipcris File and Funeral in Berlin years ago. So I've read at least two of the Harry Palmer books. Of course, though, he's unnamed in the books, but in the film, the films of Michael Caine, they do give him a name. The interesting thing is that both le Carré and Deighton do kind of find maybe bigger success in the backlash created by Bond bursting onto the scene. Both Deighton and le Carré have very different backgrounds, and their spies are very different, I think, of course, to the one we see in Fleming's work. We kind of more go back to the Eric Ambler style of spy with these particular books. So unlike the others, Len Deighton himself came from a working class background. The unnamed protagonist in the Harry Palmer books is kind of an anti-Bond. He's insubordinate, he's cynical, he's more concerned with his expense account than actually saving the world, wearing tuxedos and that kind of stuff. And I think it's also true of Bernard Sampson as well, in that he is certainly not glamorous like Bond. Interestingly, before he became a best-selling author, Deighton himself was a graphic artist, and he was a food correspondent, believe it or not, for The Observer, and he did create and write quite a lot of cookbooks. He created something called cook strips, which was minimalist illustrated recipes that were very, very popular and then published into a cookbook. And I think the eye for detail he used in this work certainly translates into his novels. And you can get his books even on like French cookery and all that kind of stuff. So Len Deighton is someone I'm rediscovering now as I am reading my way through the Game, Set and Match trilogy, as well as reading some of his non-fiction, which is really fantastic, actually, I have to say. I'm thoroughly enjoying it at the moment. Moving on to John le Carré, of course, the most famous, probably the number one spy writer for most people of all time, rightly referred to as the master. John le Carré, of course, not being his real name being David Cornwell, but like Greene and Fleming, he was an insider. He had worked in the intelligence services, I believe both for MI5 and MI6, but he didn't see anything glamorous about it, not in the way that that Fleming did, of course. His breakout novel really was The Spy Who Came In From the Cold, which was our first group read for Dr. No-vember when it started 3 years ago, and I think it was in some ways a direct answer to the whole Bond phenomenon with his tortured character of Alec Leamas and the many kind of psychological and different issues that he has to deal with, his internal demons as well as real demons in form of the both spies on his side and the other side that he has to deal with. Now, Le Carre's world is one of betrayal, bureaucracy, profound psychological strain, and of course his hero George Smiley is the ultimate anti-Bond. He's overweight, he's cuckolded, he's just quiet, unassuming, and he is a master of this whole kind of calm, quiet, intellectual warfare that goes on, this battle of minds, if you like, between him and his nemesis Carla. And I think it's apt probably for us to end this little bit on these 5 authors with a quote from Alec Leamas that he says in The Spy Who Came In From the Cold is, "What the hell do you think spies are? They're a squalid procession of vain fools, traitors, pansies, sadists and drunkards, people who play cowboys and Indians to brighten their rotten lives." And I think that is very much probably Le Carre speaking to us in answer to the type of gentleman adventurer that came before Eric Ambler, and in answer to Ian Fleming's James Bond. So there we have it, the 2 great traditions, if you like, of spy fiction. One side, that romantic, heroic world of Ian Fleming. On the other side, the more morally complex world pioneered by Ambler, and then the mantle taken up and perfected by the likes of Graham Greene, Len Deighton and John Le Carre. Whether you prefer your spies with a martini, shaken, not stirred of course, martini in hand, or a guilty conscience, we owe the entire genre to these 5 incredible authors. Now, they are of course standing on the shoulders of others, and there are others since who stand on the shoulders of these fine gentlemen. They didn't just write stories, they held up a mirror to their own anxieties that they had over the times in which they lived, and in so doing created some absolute legends. Which school of spy fiction do you prefer? Have you got a preference? Have you got a favorite author of the genre that I've not put on this list? Do you prefer the more fantasy version of the spy or the more reality? Do let me know, of course, in the comments below. And please, if you could consider liking the video and subscribing, that would be wonderful. Be jolly wonderful, actually. It would be really nice to try and get to maybe 3,000 before Christmas. Unlikely, but you never know. Anyway, so I hope you'll think about joining me and these wonderful co-hosts for Dr. November. It would be great to have you. You don't need to read the group read. You just have to read one work of espionage, whether it's fiction or non-fiction, throughout the month of November, and you will have taken part. So thanks again for watching. Do take care. Look forward to seeing you in Dr. November. Until next time, happy reading, everybody. Bye for now.